once we start establishing what it is that we actually know, we want to figure out, well, what do you need to know to be a good democratic citizen? And if you want to be somebody who's going to participate effectively in a democratic society, right, you can't just be somebody who doesn't know anything at all, right? Walking around and saying, I don't know anything, cogito ergo sum, isn't going to help you in that environment and is actually likely to lead you to make suboptimal democratic choices. So when we think about sort of what a democracy requires, being a democracy is essentially a combination of four things, right? You need a society where people have the ability to vote or in some way make their voices heard, right? You need some kind of equal representation. You need non-tyranny somehow built into the system to make sure that whatever majorities happen to emerge don't end up inflicting negative things on others. And you need deliberation. Deliberation is the idea that to actually form a successful democratic society, you can't just have people sort of individually thinking in their own little bubbles. What they need to be doing is they actually need to be engaging with others to figure out what's good for the polity, what's good for society as a whole. And that process involves a lot of discussion, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of mutual understanding. But there's information that we each need to bring to bear for that to bear fruit, right? So we need to be informed citizens in the first place to be able to have a substantive conversation, to engage with media, and thus to be able to make the decisions that are going to be best for society as a whole, right? Even if the society we're interested in is some segment of society and not necessarily absolutely everybody. For a successful democracy, then, you need to have people who are somewhat informed. And the question sort of underlying that is, well, where does that information come from, right? How is it that people become reasonably well informed about the issues, about the candidates, about whatever it might be, such that they can participate effectively? Because the one thing I can guarantee you is that there's no way that your representatives are going to do what you want if you can't communicate it to them or you don't even know what you want, right? You need to have that kind of basis for the system to work. So news is really central to this process, right? News is the core way that individuals get information about what's happening in society, what needs to be addressed, what problems there are to deal with, and carries those kinds of things to ordinary Americans or ordinary people in any country who can then render more effective decisions. And so it's this critical conduit between what's happening in government and what people need to know. It also operates on a bunch of other levels as well. Effective news is important because government needs to actually know what the people think. And while a lot of that process ends up happening through things like public opinion polls, the way members of Congress, for instance, find out about it is largely through those polls being reported in the media. So what we have then is the media as this key intermediary, right, in the form of the news, and it's an intermediary. In fact, that's where the term media comes from, which is serving this critical role as a conduit of information between ordinary people and the government, right? And helping government to know what ordinary people want, ordinary people to know what's happening in government, and also what events are happening in society that they need to be aware of and responsive to. All of this requires an informed citizenry to effectively work. Because if you don't have ordinary individuals who are informed, the opinions that they're going to reflect aren't going to make a lot of sense to people who are leading them or aren't necessarily going to express the sort of will that they would wish to express. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had this notion of the general will of the people as what it is that the people really want as this ideal goal for what government should try to achieve. One of the core problems with this notion of the general will of the people is that you need to be able to have a mechanism whereby the people in power can understand what it is that people would really desire at their most informed, because that's going to be the policy that's ideal. So how do we go about achieving that, both as individuals and as a society as a whole? Well, if you think about what people should do, and we're going to start with what people should do and then discuss a little bit later what it is that people tend to actually do. What we think of people ideally doing is behaving as what we call a Bayesian updater. What I mean by a Bayesian updater is somebody who takes in information, considers how that information relates to the things that they already know, uses that information to form a summary judgment based on the weights of various different pieces of information, and comes to some sort of decision about what we should be doing in that context. And as you learn more, you should ideally update what you know in line with the new things that you're learning. Now, of course, as we'll talk about later, there are a variety of cognitive biases, ways that information come across, and other things that impede our ability to act as Bayesian updaters, right? Psychologically, that's just not what we were designed to do, right? We didn't evolve in a democracy. But that ideal of trying to incorporate information to understand what weight the information should have, and using that to form our judgments, to come to our opinions, to discern our attitudes about various things, underlies the notion of how we think a democratic government and popular opinion should work. So what people actually do, as you can imagine, isn't updating in a wonderfully rational Bayesian way, right? What they actually do is they encounter a variety of pieces of information. They tend to anchor themselves and hold on to the pieces of information that they already knew as more important than the new things that they learn. They use a bunch of low information shortcuts, which we call heuristics, to make decisions in the absence of the best possible, most informed possible environment. As such, they end up making often effective decisions without doing all the work of looking everything up, but sometimes ineffective decisions because they're using a cue like somebody's partisanship to make a decision rather than the actual underlying piece of information. We also use a series of heuristic cues to try to make decisions on other matters that we deal with in our day-to-day lives, right? We use heuristics to decide what product to buy at a supermarket. Right? We buy the product we know. We buy the product that has the lettering that appeals to us, right? These are low information cues. They don't really tell us about the difference between product A and product B that claim to do something similar, but they help us a lot in making a decision quickly. So that's why if you go into a supermarket and you look at a series of products, that low-fat product might appeal to you, not necessarily because there's anything you're looking for that's low-fat, but because instead, the label serves as a form of endorsement, and it triggers something that this product is trying to be healthy or something else of that regard. So if you're being a good news consumer, if you're being a Bayesian updater, and you encounter a story that doesn't seem entirely credible, what you're going to do is you're going to go out and do a lot of extra work. You're going to go out and try to figure out, well, is that story actually accurate? Is it written by people who know something about this? Are the sources that it's citing relevant? And we'll talk a little bit later about how systematically to go through that process. But the idea is you would do a bunch of extra work to make sure that you're not encountering something that happens to be inaccurate.